Welcome to the weekly duck migration forecast, episode 14 for the 4th through 10th of January. Happy New Year, everybody, and hope everybody had a fantastic holiday season. I'm going to dub this one, I think, and it might get to be known as the corn episode based on some questions that I've been getting lately from folks at southern latitudes in the Mississippi Flyway mostly that are, disgruntled with the lack of ducks they've seen in past years. So here's the question. So again, remember, you can email me your questions, right, at weeklyduckmigrationforecast@gmail.com. I can cover some of them on here. I do just respond directly to some of them by email as well. But the corn question is this. Does flooding corn for the sole purpose of holding and harvesting ducks on private and public lands affect migration of ducks? So here's the point, and I will go through a series of slides to show why this is the wrong question, okay? And then I'll get into some of the, caveats of what I, in my opinion, what I think of this topic. This is the only episode I am going to cover this question because I think that this question, A, is the wrong question and it's really misdirected. And here's why. Let's think about corn at the scale of the United States and think about the planted acres of corn by large scale agriculture. So this isn't on, I've hunted in flooded corn off of rivers that's been harvested. I've hunted in standing corn on private land. I've hunted in standing corn on public land. So this is just the corn that's available, on the landscape through agriculture. It is a lot, right? We are, I would say, a slave to corn to some extent. 92 million acres are planted to corn. And most of that, if you look at the concentration of it, is in the Mississippi flyway. So to convert this into, how much food is that for ducks on the landscape, right? We work in the metric system, so I'm going to convert that to hectares. We do that in science for obvious reasons and don't use the imperial system. So we work in metric. So that's 3.72 million hectares of corn that's out there. Now, from the energy that's in corn and sampling harvested cornfields, we know that 1 hectare of harvested corn can feed 748 ducks for 1 day, or 748 duck energy days. Now, do the math on that. That's a ton of food. That is a lot of food out there for these birds. Now, you have to divide by 153, right, to get to how many birds per day that can feed for 153 days. You end up with over 182 million ducks that can be fed by this corn for 153 days. Let's put this into perspective with how many ducks are on this continent. Now, it's an index, but they do count a lot of the birds, right? The waterfowl survey says that there's 38.9 million total ducks. And those, now think about this, 182 million ducks can be fed for 153 days, which is from September till the end of January. So minus anything that's on the landscape as flooded corn, there's a ton of corn out there. And these birds are really good at finding this. And these corn acres have increased in the US since 1955. Since 1987, when we see this really large increase, there's been an addition of over 730,000 acres per year, or enough to feed an additional 1.4 million ducks for 153 days each year on this land. In the R squared, which means how much variation in corn acres is just explained by year, is 0.78. So we're explaining 78% of the variation in the acres of corn with year, which means this is something that's increasing. Ducks know how to find food, okay? And they're going to find it. And so there is easily enough just in harvested cornfields, waste grain available to feed these birds. The point here really is that ducks are not food limited to a large degree in the fall. The crunch time is a surviving winter, and then in the spring, the foods that they need to go back and nest. So that's where the wetlands really come into play. And again, these corn acres are really centered in the Mississippi flyway. So if you want to talk about ducks hanging north for any particular reason, there's enough in these unharvested cornfields to make that happen between the Great Lakes region and the upper Midwest to a large degree. Now, at the same time, at southern latitudes, rice acreage in coastal Louisiana and Texas has declined by about 50% from the 1980s to the 2010s, right? And if you look at a place like Missouri, because there's new strains of rice and with climate change, which is not a hoax. I keep getting told this is a hoax. It's absolutely solid science. So that's complete BS. But between different varieties of rice and changing climates, look at Missouri's production actually increases. So we see changes in food availability at this large scale on the landscape for ducks. And they're really good at finding food, right? These are dinosaurs. If you haven't kept up, dinosaurs didn't die out. Those that were adaptable and were able to find food and cover and reproduce, which ducks are uh, descendants of pretty much velociraptors, they were able to make it. And these animals are food finding machines. So at the large scale, food has changed drastically on this continent, and the birds are finding it. Now let's talk about the weather, right? We've got this WSI, or Weather Severity Index, for mallards. And at some threshold, they start to decrease in abundance at any one location. And remember, what goes in this weather severity index is just temperature and snow. So how cold is it? How much snow is on the ground? How many days has it been below freezing? And how many days has there at least been 1 inch of snow? And in combination, that gives us a value that then we predict the rate of change in relative abundance of these ducks. Or are they increasing or are they decreasing? So what we see is there's this period where there's just no migration, right? This is well before birds will even really start to move. It's very warm temperatures. And then we have this period above the x-axis of increasing abundance. And then at some point beyond that threshold, we have decreasing abundance. Now that line that cuts through there is the trend line. Okay, and that's the average of all the variability of those dots. But look at, there is a lot of variability in those dots in whether birds are increasing or decreasing. So let's dissect that. So we even see before it gets cold at times, there's movement of mallards out of locations, and presumably further south. It can also be east and west because there's no reason they have to go south. But most of those clusters, as we approach zero, which is that up and down or y-axis, as we approach zero, mostly what we see are increases in mallards. And this is largely due to declining temperatures at latitudes north of those locations so that birds show up. Then as we approach the threshold, after we pass a mean daily temperature that's at freezing, and we approach that blue dots, that black dot that's the threshold, we still see increases in birds, and at times we see some decreases in birds, right? And this is that there is variation around this. But here's what's interesting. Once you hit this threshold, look at the abundance of dots below the y-axis, which is negative rate of change or very strong declines in the abundance of mallards at a location. Now look above it. There are actually very few dots where we still see some increase, and that increase, if it happens, is very slight. So what is this telling us? It's pretty much telling us that, heck, you can have all the food in the world at a location, but when it gets cold, it snows, and there's ice, these birds leave. Let's look at some data from a publication we produced in the Wildlife Society Bulletin. Again, these are facts, they're published, and we've done a lot of data analysis on this. So the WSI is what makes, it's a calculation that determines the weather that makes ducks migrate. So we looked at changes in the Weather Severity Index in the Mississippi Atlantic Flyway from 1979 to 2013. And found that for the months of November, December, and January, for ducks about the size of a mallard, black duck, or pintail, that the line where the threshold weather severity index for these animals had been met had moved much further north, right? By 2,866 square kilometers annually from 1979 to 2013, or basically almost 97,000 square kilometers that is now available to ducks to stay and feed that was not in 1979. So if we use the mean, available duck use days, or how many ducks can a square kilometer support of food on the landscape from the upper Mississippi River Great Lakes Joint Venture region, that mean is 1,572 ducks. And that's a ton of duck use days that are now available at northern latitudes that once weren't. What this actually comes out to be is about 1.65 million ducks that can feed each day at latitudes north of where they used to for a 92-day period from November to January. And that's just on average. On really mild years, this number is as high as 3.2 million ducks that can stay north. So where are your ducks? They're everywhere. We also hear that the natural migration has changed and that we want to restore the natural migration, and that flooding corn goes against the natural migration. The word natural is completely loaded. I think what it means is that folks that just aren't seeing ducks where they're at now want it to go back to the days when they saw ducks. Here's the deal. If you've not read this book, Rising Tide by John Barry, The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 and How It Changed America, please do. Because a lot of this is about politics and how the federal government took over control of rivers and flooding, and states lost rights. And these changes to the Mississippi drainage greatly decreased natural processes of the river and the coastal wetlands that the river feeds, right? So the word natural is extremely loaded. There's no such thing anymore. We've affected this planet so much that there is no such thing as natural. What are we trying to do through restoring wetlands is to put some of this stuff back. Look at this image of the Mississippi alluvial valley in the 1950s and the wetland forest cover. And let's let that transition to the year 2001. So even in the Mississippi alluvial valley, right, at southern latitudes, we lost lots of forest cover. People farmed without the fear of flooding. And nowadays we have a very artificial system of flooding, and we've lost a lot of wetlands. Now, if you look, there's also something in that image that says WRP lands as of 2001, and those are Wetland Reserve Program lands. So a lot of what organizations are trying to do is put some of this wetland actually back onto the landscape to really provide that natural and native habitat that used to exist. Now, this is a little bit dated, but by 2009 in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, there were 11,000 Wetland Reserve Program projects on 2 million diverse acres. And I worked across a lot of this when I spent several years working at Mississippi State University. And these are not all flooded corn. In fact, on Wetland Reserve Program lands, you were only allowed to plant 5% of your acreage to crops. Now, why is this going on? There's been massive wetland loss. Look at these, right? Almost all of these are greater than 50%. And a lot of this loss is the largest in the Corn Belt, Iowa, Missouri, Illinois. These are massive losses. And the gains that we have from replacing historic wetlands don't even start to touch the historic loss in most places. And think about it. Wetlands provide habitat for waterfowl, other wetland wildlife, fish, people. They provide flood control, purify our water. It's not just about ducks, although a lot of these are restored for ducks. And nearly all of our freshwater fish actually have to go into wetlands to spawn. So these are critical locations for a lot of the things that we really enjoy. What's interesting when you go on these wetland reserve program lands is that duck blinds are pretty much ubiquitous or everywhere, right? People don't get into this to feel good about wetlands. They get into this to shoot ducks because at heart they're passionate duck hunters. They want to put something back, but at the end of the day, they want to kill ducks. I don't think I worked on a single one of these wetland reserve program properties that wasn't also a hunting property. In these wetlands, right, provide habitat for over 900 species across the continent. 50% of our endangered and threatened species are wetland species. You know why? Because we've decimated wetlands for the most part, and we're doing our best to put them back. And by the way, one of those species that benefits from wetlands is also humans, for all of you that pursue ducks and know. And if we look at where WRP acres are enrolled, they're really focused a lot on where those major losses are. But if you look at the big ones, Louisiana is certainly one of them, with some of the greatest acreage enrolled, as well as Arkansas, Mississippi, and Texas. A lot of places where people are complaining about not seeing birds, there's definitely habitat being put on the ground. One of the biggest problems for coastal Louisiana is that just that 40% of those wetlands have been lost and converted to open water. And the scenario going forward with sea level rise, which again is not a hoax, that stuff is disappearing, is pretty rough. So birds have more food at northern latitudes because of just corn acreage in general. It's not getting cold enough to make them come south. Rice acres have declined in coastal Louisiana and Texas, and you got less wetland than you used to. These birds follow the food and they follow the resources. And when we talk about natural migration, I guess this one's a little bit of a stretch, but guess what? Corn's a grass. It's not natural, it's not native. Barnyard grass, Echinocloa cruzgali, not native to North America, right? So neither one of these are natural, but one of the main focuses of moist soil management and restoring these areas that the rivers used to scour out and grow annual plants. One of the focuses is growing something like barnyard grass. Guess what? It produces a ton of duck energy days. Look around my boots there, right? That's all barnyard grass seed. In a managed moist soil wetland, that produces 4,705 duck energy days per hectare, where a harvested cornfield through waste grain produces 748 duck energy days, right? So it's a slippery slope to attack natural migrations because none of this stuff is natural. And the one that really I think eats at me the most is a lot of these folks are upset that they're not seeing ducks, so they're calling on folks to, abandon Delta Waterfowl and Ducks Unlimited. Look, we're all at the conservation table together. These organizations combined have done more for duck hunters than any other organization. And you should be, everybody that duck hunts should be a member of both of them. Look, the conservation table is diverse, and there are enough people that don't even want us duck hunting. So let's not get into infighting, right? So let's stay together. So here's the final comment. I'm not taking on the corn question again. I think it's BS. It's a completely misdirected question. There's videos out there that seem pretty convincing, but pointing the finger at one single thing, as you can see, it is not the solution. It never usually is, right? Is there more food on the landscape? Yes. But there's enough just from unharvested corn alone. If somebody wants to plant corn, flood it, and shoot ducks on it, fine. Good for them. If somebody wants to restore a wetland, grow barnyard grass, shoot ducks over it, fine by me. These ducks have adapted over millennia, and they're food finding and food eating machines. I think it's best that as duck hunters that we adapt as well and try to be mobile. With an animal that is that adapted, with changing food on the landscape because of all the unnatural things we do by clearing land and growing food, those birds are going to adapt. So no single duck hunter should ever sit against the same tree for 100 years and expect to see the same thing for 100 years. because the ducks ain't going to do it. They're going to follow the food. So I think as duck hunters, it's our job to follow the ducks and continue to find ways to restore wetlands that's habitat for waterfowl, other wetland wildlife, as well as people. So that's my soapbox, folks. I think that's pretty damn convincing. I sure hope so. So I'm going to jump into the forecast now. So our snow looks a little bit better. We got a really good shot of snow in the upper Midwest last week relative to January at this time. We had a big thaw around January this time. So the snow cover is looking pretty good. I'll compare this later on. We got a heck of a lot of rain south of that snow line, southern Missouri, basically up the mist to the Boot Hill, Missouri, and then up through the Ohio River Valley. And even up into central New York where we're at, we got a lot of good rain last week for ducks to take advantage of newly flooded habitat. So the summary for this week is right. There was a lot of folks in mid latitudes in the Mississippi Flyway got much needed rain. There was a reasonable amount of snow in the upper Midwest. There's only a few ducks left at the latitude of, I'd say, Iowa in the Mississippi Flyway. So ducks are mostly, squished between there and southern latitudes where it's relatively warm. We had flooding in the Great Lakes region and abundant rains in the mid-Atlantic on the Atlantic coast as well this last week, which really probably spread ducks out. In the coming week, unfortunately, we're not seeing a lot for the WSI to cause movement of mallards or black ducks out of their current locations. The WSI for pintail and gadwall suggests maybe some minor movements out of mid-latitudes towards southern locales, but the abundant water that's on the landscape now in places may delay that. Mostly ducks are likely to follow food that is floodwater and avoid disturbance in the coming weeks. So this is about being mobile and finding birds, go where they're at for sure. Here's the WSI table for mallard and black duck. As I said, that latitude of Iowa south, most of the mallards are froze out of there. Missouri's got, ice kind of coming and going, like their wetlands ice up, but it's not long enough, right? This is this mid-latitude area where these ducks can kind of hang nowadays. It's just not strong enough. So everything, as you go east, once you get south to Memphis, you don't see anything strong enough to make mallards move, and then everything Ohio and towards the east is really mild for the coming week for mallards and black ducks. Pintail, we see a little bit of something going on mid-Atlantic coast of the Atlantic Flyway, but we've seen some blues in Memphis before, but nothing this week. So don't expect a lot of action on the pintail end, maybe a little bit in the Atlantic Flyway. Gadwall, relatively similar. Any of these WSI values are, just below that -7 threshold. So it's, you're in -6s, -5s. So, a lot of where Gadwall, there'll be some, again, minor movements of pintail and Gadwall, more so I'd say in the Atlantic Flyway than the Mississippi, but nothing really substantial in the coming week. And then when we get into shoveler, I'm going to breeze through these because these are all blue. And then widgeon and green-winged teal. A lot of these birds, right, are just moving around at this point where they're at based on food availability and disturbance. And there's no real cold shot coming. Highs and lows are very consistent for the coming weeks. So, my suggestion to folks is to give some places some rest, let birds build up. And make sure you at least get one good shoot this week. River gauges improved, I'd say, in most places from last week. We got a lot of high water in places. I mean, there are certain places that are obviously still dry, but there was a good swath of rain that went Oklahoma, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and up into New York. The mid-Atlantic coast, if anything, probably has too much water. I'd say folks, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama might be hurting because there's just a lot of water here that has the potential to be holding birds up on you. One of the things I want to do is compare river gauges to the snowfall this week, which is really interesting. If we look at where those river gauges start to go real nice and darker blue colors where we've got higher water and maybe potential flooding, That's that system that was just, this was a big system. It produced snow to the north of that line, and it produced a lot of water to the south of it. And this is one of these cases, right, of unharvested corn. I mean, I drove around yesterday. It was the last day of our duck season. I've shot a fair number of birds. It was a tough year because it was dry. I drove around, watch guys shoot ducks in cornfields yesterday, and that's what's going on. I mean, we're in central New York in the first week of January, and we've got people in cornfields that are flooded from rivers and from snowmelt that are shooting ducks, and those ducks just aren't going to make it further south, as far south as they need to for people. So that's just about food and water on the landscape. All right. Thanks, folks. Very long episode this week, but I hope you really enjoyed the corn episode. Please, I'm sure this is going to get some email sent to me. Weekly duck migration forecast at gmail.com. Subscribe to this YouTube channel if you want to keep up. I'm doing these for a few more weeks right through the end of duck season. So everybody be safe, shoot straight, have a good week. Thanks.